So, moving right along, one of the things that a number of you found interesting about this reading was the acquisitiveness. Sure, libraries like to build up their holdings. This is just sort of the nature of collecting. But the ways through which the librarians in Alexandria added to their collections was quite interesting. And again, a bunch of you noticed this. What they would do was wait for ships to come into the port, and Alexandria would have been like the New York City of their day. You know, all the goods of the world are floating in and out of Alexandria. When ships would come in, what the librarians, the guards, whatever you want to call them, would do would be to hop aboard the ships, confiscate, they'd say borrow, but confiscate the original manuscripts that were on board. Because you can imagine in a book where, or in an age where books are rare, these are precious commodities. There's going to be a trade in books. They're going to be worth a lot of money. And so they'll go on board, they'll seize the goods, they'll take them back to the library for safekeeping, they'll copy the book out, and then they'll return the copy to the original owner or to the merchant who's carrying it in his vessel. And then, as I said, they'll keep the original in the library for safekeeping. But first off, who's to say, now that the original is no longer available to us, that the copy hasn't been seriously compromised? Now, it looks all nice and tidy, everything it is consistent, but that's not to say that it looks anything like the original. We're giving the corrected version out into the world again, and we're keeping the original under lock and key, or, protected by armed guards so nobody can get at it. And little by little, all of the originals are making their way into the library. Not only do we already have a problem because the originals aren't available, but if all of the originals are stored in one place, and you'll notice that Heller-Roazen put a little picture of the papyrus plant on there. Yeah, these texts were written on paper. If you've ever seen papyrus, the closest thing to it is rolling paper. All it takes, in other words, is one match, one spark for the entire library to go up in flames. And with it, all of the originals and all of the copies that are out there, there's now no longer anything against which to check them. So this is an incredibly problematic activity. And if you honestly wanted to call it by its proper name, curation of libraries is indistinguishable now from piracy. And in concert with that, because each of the various cities, the Mediterranean is dotted by major cities, each of which wants to see itself as a metropolitan center, all competing with one another for prestige. One of the ways that a city, in our days, it's who's got the, winning football team, who gets to bring home the Super Bowl trophy this year, or who's got the tallest skyscraper, what have you. But one of the ways that these cities in ancient times vied with one another for preeminence was who had the most complete library. There becomes not only a competition to see who can acquire the most books, but also there becomes a black market for texts. If some guy comes walking along and says to one of the librarians, well, you think you've got the complete works of Plato, but you haven't seen what I've got. I've got a lost work of Plato that nobody has ever read before, and it's the only copy. So how much would you be willing to pay to look in my trunk and possibly acquire this? Suddenly, it's not that forgery wasn't possible prior to this. Obviously it was. But now there becomes a lucrative market for forgeries, and entire industry springs up around this. So once again, it's the effort of preserving the tradition, which has become indistinguishable from the destruction of tradition. And this is why Heller-Roazen is going to say, fire or no fire, Who knows? Half the records say that there was a fire, and of those records that say there was a fire, each different record's going to give a different description of how much was burned, and whereas and then there's all those texts which are arguing there never was a fire in the first place, and Heller-Roazen's conclusion is this. Although, again, he leaves it implicit. It's there for us to find if we choose to. There didn't even need to be a fire. So great was the destruction wrought upon the contents of the Library of Alexandria by the librarians who worked there that there didn't even need to be a fire. Fire, in many respects, is just an abbreviated or an emblematic representation of what was going on at the library anyway. And I will say this, that when we have a famous story, or when we have two bodies of important evidence which mutually contradict one another to such an extent that we become actively disturbed by these contradictions, we've got to find a way to cover over, or in some way or another artificially to synthesize the two contradictory bodies of evidence into a seemingly consistent whole. And the word for the fabrication that we use to suture over this wound or to suture up this lacuna is myth. And that's exactly what is going on here. The story of the fire of the Library of Alexandria is a myth.
He's the love of my life, but I have no idea what he does for a living.
How long you been married?
20 years next year.
You have no idea what he does for a living?
No, I've never met his coworkers. I've never been to his
Okay.
office. He said he works in innovation strategy. I have no idea what that is.
Are you eating good?
Yes.
You all live in a nice house?
Yes, we do.
You have a nice car?
Yes.
Yeah, he's a drug dealer.
I don't think so. I hope not.
Thank you for coming.
All right, finally, we got to ask ourselves this question. I'm seeing that I've run on for quite a while now, so I'm going to try to wrap up for my sake, but also for yours. It could look to us that these librarians are actually quite nefarious characters, falsifying the past, stealing, forging. I have to say that I don't, and some of you used the word, this looks like an unethical activity to me. I don't think it was deliberately unethical activity. I believe that these librarians were driven by a very specific and identifiable ethic, though it does take some speculation on my part. But when I use the word drive, and here this is kind of an anticipation of what you'll see in Catherine Malibu. Remember that what she's talking about in her writings is the death drive. So there's that word drive. It's a sort of like irresistible compulsion to continue to do something. It could be exercising, it could be dieting, it could be cleaning, it could be studying, it could be collecting. These kind of compulsive activities for Malibu are going to be manifestations of the death drive. And the term that Heller-Roazen is going to use is bibliomania. Let me get my fingers there. Bibliomania. Mania, we know what that means. A compulsion in biblio is book. So this compulsive collecting, this compulsive forging, this compulsive correcting. What was motivating it? Yeah, underneath it all, it's a kind of irresistible drive, but from a more conscious perspective, what did these guys believe that made them want to, it says, they did nothing their entire lives but read and devour and correct all of these manuscripts, what were they thinking? What I'd like to suggest is this. It goes back to the word that best encapsulates the Alexandrian view of the world, and that is cosmos. Now, for us, cosmos is that show by Neil deGrasse Tyson. Back in the 70s, it was Carl Sagan. And for us, cosmos means outer space. That's not what these guys had in mind. What cosmos means for them is world. Cosmos also means order. And cosmos also means beautiful. It's this combination which gives us a view of how they saw reality. Reality for them, or if you will, the world for them, was one great artifice created by some intelligent designer who built the world as a series of concentric spheres, each of which is recapitulating a larger sphere on a smaller level. To say it very, very succinctly, there's a macrocosm, a macrocosmos, and a microcosmos, and one should be the mirror image in miniature or the recapitulation of the other. And if the world really is built in this series of concentric spheres, then it's got to have a center. And the competition amongst the Mediterranean cities that I've been talking about is really to see who is at the very center of the cosmos. And that's what the Ptolemaic center is all about. That whatever that suite of buildings was, it would seem that the library was at the very center of it. And the library, as the microcosmic center of the universe, had to be, if you will, the literary equivalent of everything that went on outside. It had to be the conversion of all real life events and all external objects into a microcosmic literary translation, a microcosmic literary equivalent. And I would venture to suggest that driving the librarian's determination to make sure that this microcosmic library recapitulation of the macrocosmic or the macrocosm is as perfect as possible is a belief that there is a God who's watching over all of this. Now, well, they're Greeks or they're Egyptians, they're polytheists. By this time, the idea that there are many gods is really falling out of currency as a result of the passage through Plato's philosophy and through Aristotle's philosophy and its appropriation by the type of Stoic logic, which I think is underwriting the activities in the Library of Alexandria. We've essentially now moved into an age of monotheism. So God now is not some guy with a long beard like Zeus eating grapes up in heaven and, throwing down thunderbolts while all of his children raise hell amongst the warriors of Greece and Troy. There's only one God. That God is metaphysical, which is to say doesn't have a body, but is all powerful. And in addition to that, all-knowing and all-seeing. And really what you want to think of here, I'll do something that's kind of amusing to me, but you want to think of God as kind of the great grammarian in the sky. He's this all-seeing eye, perhaps embodied or taking as his avatar the sun, the solar disk, which sweeps over the world or scans over the world on a daily basis, and looking down on from high is going to look at the contents of the Library of Alexandria, beginning with the Pinakes, which puts everything into paradigmatic order. It's going to scan it, and like I said, like the great grammarian in the sky, as it were, with red pen in hand, look down and correct your test. Look down and look for all the errors in your library, look for all the errors in the documents which you have not only collected but collated and corrected, and you're going to get struck for every mistake that the great grammarian finds. Therefore, you feel morally obligated. Under what penalty? I don't know enough about Stoic philosophy and religion to say, but these people feel morally obligated to set the record straight, and they are not going to stop until they have corrected and eliminated every last error. So this is what's going on in the Library of Alexandria. And I'll say one last thing about the library, and then I'm kind of done. This could seem insane, but it's completely in keeping with one of the fundamental forms of technology and research that was part of Alexandrian culture at the time, and this would have been the control over metals. So it wasn't all that long ago that we were in the Bronze Age, and now we've entered into an age of iron, newer, stronger metals, which can produce all kinds of results that earlier cruder metals were not able to achieve. So one, for practical purposes, but even more so for intellectual and I will say even spiritual purposes, Alexandrian culture is interested in the purification of various substances by submitting it to heat, and heat is generated, last time I checked, by fire, and purging these substances of all impurities. You're going to do it in one of two places. You can do it if you're working with metal inside of a crucible. There's that term from high school English. Everybody had to read that play. Or if you're working with fluids, say from plants and things like that, then you'll put it not inside of a crucible, but you'll put it inside of an alembic, and you are going to try to extract the essence from out of the raw materials into which you put into the container. Now, you can use whatever term you want for this, but the term that these guys would have used, and it's one that you should recognize, is alchemy. Alchemy is kind of like proto-chemistry, but the big difference between chemistry and alchemy is that alchemy, as we read back in Marcel Mauss, is in addition to the physical properties involved in the substances being put into the crucible or into the alembic, it's also interested in spiritual powers, which are either brought down or brought out of the substances. Alchemy is chemistry before it has been separated from magic. So there's a kind of magic in the work of the Library of Alexandria, and this is just part and parcel of Alexandrian culture. Purification, religion, magic are all held together, actually taking physical substances and transforming them into language, into pure idea. Once we realize as moderns that everything that was going on in the Library of Alexandria was fraudulent, if you're involved in the business of philology, of trying to reconstruct originals out of these copies, out of these processed texts, you're going to realize eventually that there's no possibility of getting back to the original. Why not? Well, we'll just take our best critical skills and we will apply these to the speculative reconstruction of the text, of the architects. But what Heller-Roazen is so quick to point out is, but don't you see, it's these very same critical tools which we would use now to correct the original text, which messed them up in the first place. The only thing these critical tools could possibly do is butcher the thing even more. Yeah, it's going to look more cosmetic, to use that term cosmos, cosmetology. It comes from the same word. It's going to look more cosmetic, but the very, very consistency of what you produced is only going to be further evidence of the fact that you've gotten even farther away from the original. So why not call the whole chase off? And this is exactly what Nietzsche does. He's the great German philosopher who began as the brightest young classics scholar of Germany. He was like head of the Department of Classics at his Germany in Basel, I think before he was 30. I mean, just a prodigious talent. But it's not long in his career before he realizes that everything we're doing is a fraud. The metaphor that he uses comes from the Spanish literature, the Golden Age. He says that this is a quixotic endeavor. And that word quixotic comes from Don Quixote, the dude who's completely deceived. He thinks he's fighting dragons when he's really just charging at windmills. So Nietzsche is like, this is absolutely redonkulous. We're never going to get to the original. Let's call the whole chase off. He quits his position at the university and he goes off to write philosophy, but it's philosophy of a very, very different kind. And in addition to writing philosophy, he produces maybe his most famous book, Zarathustra, and it's there where I think he's admitting in so many words that sure, we want myth in modern times. We need myth in modern times, but because we can't get back to the original myths, the only myths that we're going to have of any value to us, of any validity, are going to be the myths that we create ourselves. And so he begins to write fiction. He gives up the philological endeavor, and Heller-Roazen, who's read all of this stuff and more, including Nietzsche, he's then going to want to say, well, how come I don't call off the chase? Why don't I quit my job at Princeton? And it's not for cynical reasons that he's staying there. I mean, if you read any of his works, you can tell the guy really loves this stuff. So, how come he doesn't give up like Nietzsche? He explains it through a different story, not that of Don Quixote, but that of Alice through the Looking Glass. So in a phrase that's become very popular amongst people your age these days, he's gone down the rabbit hole. Once we have gotten the bug, once you've caught the case, you're in, and there's no getting out again, but you just have to enjoy the chase. And this is what Heller-Roazen's doing. Although he realizes fully well that we will never see what the original Alexandria was, just like we'll never see what the original Homer was. What we do see when we, to the best of our abilities, and in a way, if you've caught the case, if you've caught the bug, if you've gone down the rabbit hole, you can't help yourself. Some mania takes over and you just research and reconstruct. When we finally come up with what to us looks to be a truly compelling reconstruction of the past, what we have to step back and recognize is what we've most created is a faithful mirror image of ourselves. What we see in the past is actually going to be who we believe ourselves to be. The past is our projection of our own unrecognized values and interests. Here, I will segue off into Malibu, and then I'm definitively done because I'm talked out, and you're probably sick of hearing me. If we assume that what I'm saying is correct, that the Library of Alexandria really is a projection of our own greatest interests and concerns in current times, what does the Library of Alexandria, this constant project of editing and editing and editing and rewriting, the Library of Alexandria is really just a projection into the past of that part of ourselves we find most interesting. And if you know anything about the cool things to study right now at the university, or the cool things to study when it comes to human nature and the human body, the coolest thing to study is the brain. Because the brain is that part of the body which we know to be most plastic. And there's that term from Catherine Malibu. Neuroplasticity is a huge topic of research and even popular science right now. But what science has come to discover in the last decade or two, it's around 2000 that all of this research really gets going, is that not only is the brain not the most fragile and irreparable part of the body, but it's the part of the body that is most able to repair itself, and that, as a matter of fact, continues to repair itself constantly throughout its entire life. Not only is the brain repairing itself, but through a process known as apoptosis, the brain is actively burning away its own cells, specifically so that it can rebuild itself, creating new synapses, new connections. What the brain is doing, the mind is constantly rewriting itself, or we are constantly rewriting our own histories, our own biographies, turning ourselves into something new in order that we can go on to live another day in an ever-changing world. So creation, preservation, and destruction are all bound up with one another. This is the healthy way that we go through the world. You have to become something that you would never have imagined yourself to be. You have to become something that the earlier you could never recognize, just as the current you, if it could see the you that you used to be, it wouldn't recognize itself in that former self because you've gone on to become something new. So this is what neuroplasticity is all about. This, I think, is the common theme in Heller-Roazen and Malibu, though I will say that I think Malibu dares to go a little bit further than Heller-Roazen, because she's the one, even though Heller-Roazen will talk about disasters and catastrophes, she's the one who begins to look at what happens when this explosive, destructive underside of plasticity suddenly gains the upper hand, and we begin to see people who change so radically and so suddenly as a result of trauma of one sort or another, whether it's medical trauma, whether it's social trauma, whether it's a physical injury. These people change in an instant and in a way which is absolutely irrecuperable. They become strangers to themselves and everybody else. And although this is not a cheery topic, it's one that Malibu has for a number of years considered to be a very important one to explore. I'll tell you really quickly the reason she got into neurology and brain chemistry and irrecuperable loss is because sometime after writing her dissertation on the philosophy of mind, she became the principal care provider for a family member who had Alzheimer's. And so she was watching her beloved aunt's brain burn itself away on a regular basis. And then this aunt was becoming an entirely different person day after day after day. And I think this was sufficiently painful enough for Malibu that she began working through the trauma of watching this family member fall apart or become an alien to her and to herself on a daily basis. But, you can't study the mind, be witness to something like this on a regular basis and not think that it's not going to modify your studies. And so she not only cares for somebody who's experiencing the dark side of plasticity on a daily basis, but she begins to study it herself theoretically, and her research takes a very, very different direction, one that she's pursuing as relentlessly as Freud was pursuing the death drive. And I'll say here, Freud never, to his own satisfaction, is able to formulate the death drive in terms that he finds acceptable, but it's through the very failure of Freud's ability to formulate the death drive or to theorize the death drive that he goes back to the project again and again and again, and himself becomes the living embodiment of the death drive, writing and writing and writing and writing, failing and failing and writing some more. His research is driven by the death drive. And here you can see connections back to Mose, Petrosky, and to Leo Steinberg, and all kinds of other things. So, these aren't necessarily the most cheerful topics, but Malibu turns to them for both theoretical and for personal reasons. And I have to say now, as we look at the political world, as as we look at the environment around us, as we look at so many things that we've taken for granted, life itself now thrown into a state of catastrophe, and each catastrophe followed by another. How much longer do we have? Is it not time for us to, perhaps for the very first time, begin to look clearly and steadily at the possibility of mass extinction, perhaps even our own extinction? So that's where Malibu's willing to go, and I think it's a good way to take us into our future readings. So I hope this has been an interesting set of videos for you to watch. I still have to edit them, but good luck to you as you continue your work in this class and all of your other classes. I'll remain available to you. I'm going to call it quits at that. Hope this was enjoyable to you and made some sense. Okay, peace out. Bye.